Section 1. Olivia Evans had never imagined her life would come to this. Standing outside the towering wrought iron gates of Wolf Manor, clutching the straps of her worn-out purse, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had spent the past month searching for a job, any job, that could help her afford the mounting hospital bills for her son, Noah. The surgery he needed wasn't just a medical procedure. It was a race against time. The doctors had been clear. Without it, his condition would only worsen, and the thought of losing him was something Olivia couldn't even allow herself to consider. The billionaire was a man wrapped in mystery, known more for his ruthless business tactics than for any sort of kindness. Magazines painted him as a cold, distant man, a CEO who built his empire with an iron fist and an indifference to anything outside of his business world. His name was whispered in financial circles, his deals making headlines, but beyond that, no one seemed to know much about him. Olivia didn't care about his reputation. All she cared about was earning enough to save her son. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the intercom button. A sharp, clipped voice answered, "Yes, I'm Olivia Evans. I have an interview for the housekeeper position." There was a pause before the gate buzzed open. With hesitant steps, Olivia walked up the long driveway, flanked by manicured hedges and towering oak trees. The sheer size of the estate was overwhelming. The mansion itself loomed in the distance, a sprawling masterpiece of modern architecture with sleek glass windows and sharp steel edges. It was the kind of home that screamed power. She wasn't used to places like this, but she was willing to work anywhere, for anyone, if it meant Noah got his surgery. A uniformed butler greeted her at the door, his expression unreadable. "This way." She followed him through the grand entrance, trying not to let her mouth drop open at the opulence around her. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above, casting a warm glow over the marble floors. The air smelled of expensive cologne and polished wood, and for a brief moment Olivia felt completely out of place. They reached a massive study where a man stood behind a mahogany desk, flipping through documents. He didn't look up right away, but when he did, his gaze pinned her in place. Adrian Wolf. She had seen photos of him in business magazines, but they hadn't done him justice. Tall, broad-shouldered, with chiseled features and an air of effortless authority, he was the kind of man who could silence a room without saying a word. His piercing gray eyes studied her, assessing, calculating. "Miss Evans," he said smoothly, finally closing the file in his hands. "You're here for the housekeeping position." Olivia forced herself to nod. "Yes, sir." He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit." She did, gripping her purse tightly in her lap. Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Your resume is underwhelming." She swallowed. "I know I don't have much experience, but I'm a hard worker. I learn quickly. And He held up a hand, silencing her. "I don't hire people out of pity, Miss Evans. If you're here looking for charity, you've come to the wrong place." Heat rose to Olivia's cheeks. "I'm not looking for charity. I just need a job." His expression remained unreadable for a moment before he exhaled, his gaze flicking to the butler standing nearby. "Samuel, show her to the staff quarters. She starts today." Olivia blinked. "Wait, just like that?" Adrian's lips twitched, almost as if he found her surprise amusing. "You said you needed a job. Now you have one." And just like that, her life inside Wolf Manor began. The work was demanding, but Olivia was used to hard labor. She scrubbed floors, polished furniture, and ensured that every inch of the vast estate was spotless. The other staff members were polite but distant, and it didn't take long for Olivia to realize that no one here really knew Adrian Wolf. He was a man who operated in shadows, keeping his life and emotions locked away from the world. And yet, despite his cold exterior, she couldn't ignore the way he watched her. He never spoke much, but his presence was undeniable. He would pass by while she was working, his sharp gaze lingering on her for just a moment too long before he continued on his way. And then there were the small moments, things she didn't expect, like the day she accidentally knocked over a vase in the study. She had braced herself for his fury, but instead, he had merely stared at the broken shards for a long moment before saying, "It was hideous anyway." Or the night she had been cleaning late and had dozed off on the kitchen counter. She had woken up to a thick, warm blanket draped over her shoulders, the scent of expensive cologne lingering in the fabric. She had never seen Adrian do it, but she knew it had been him. And then there was Noah. She had kept her son a secret from the staff, not wanting anyone to know about her struggles. But one day, after her shift, she had rushed to the hospital to check on him, only to find that his medical bills had been mysteriously paid. Her stomach had dropped. There was only one person who could have done it. When she returned to the estate that evening, she marched straight into Adrian's study without knocking. He was sitting behind his desk as usual, reviewing documents. He barely glanced up. "You paid my son's bills," she said, her voice trembling. He flipped a page. "And? Why?" He sighed, setting the papers down. "Because I can." Olivia clenched her fists. "I don't need your money." His gray eyes darkened. "Your son does." Her throat tightened. "I will pay you back." Adrian tilted his head, something unreadable flashing in his expression. "And how exactly do you plan to do that, Miss Evans?" "I'll work double shifts. I'll take on extra responsibilities. Whatever it takes." For the first time, something close to amusement flickered in his gaze. "Interesting," he murmured. "You'd rather break yourself in half than accept help." "I don't want your charity," she said firmly. Adrian studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then let's make a deal." Olivia hesitated. "What kind of deal?" A slow, almost dangerous smirk curved his lips. "One that benefits us both." And just like that, everything changed. Section 2. Olivia's breath hitched at Adrian's words. A deal. She had expected him to dismiss her or insist she take the money as a handout, but this was different. Her instinct screamed at her to refuse. A man like Adrian Wolfe didn't make deals out of kindness. There had to be something in it for him, something he wasn't saying. Still, she needed the money. Noah needed the surgery. So, despite the warning bells in her mind, she forced herself to meet his gaze. What kind of deal? Adrian leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he studied her. The room was silent, save for the faint ticking of an expensive grandfather clock in the corner. "I need someone I can trust," he said finally. Olivia frowned. "For what?" "I've been hosting more events lately. Charity galas, investor meetings, fundraisers, the type of affairs where appearances matter." She still didn't understand where he was going with this. And I require a companion at these functions." Her stomach flipped. "You want me to pretend to be your, what? Your date?" His lips twitched slightly, though it wasn't quite a smile. "More like an assistant who blends in well with high society." Olivia's pulse pounded. "I don't belong in those circles." Adrian shrugged. "Neither did I once, but I learned." She shook her head. "You're a billionaire. That's different. And you're a quick learner," he countered. "You handle yourself well under pressure. You have poise. And most importantly, you don't grovel." She flinched at the last part. "You mean I don't fall at your feet like the others?" she muttered. Adrian's gaze sharpened. "Exactly." Olivia swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had spent weeks scrubbing his floors, polishing his silverware, folding his sheets. Now he wanted her to be part of his world. It didn't make sense, unless... Adrian was silent for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. "Because I trust you." That made no sense. Trust her? He barely knew her. Still, the weight in his words made her chest tighten. She could walk away, she could refuse and keep working as a maid, struggling to save enough for Noah's surgery. Or she could accept and change both of their lives forever. Her fingers trembled as she exhaled slowly. "What exactly would I have to do?" Adrian's gaze never left hers. "Attend events with me. Smile when necessary. Keep your opinions to yourself unless I ask for them. And most importantly, act as though you belong." Her stomach churned. "People will know I'm not one of them. They'll assume what I want them to assume," Adrian said simply. "That's how this world works." She clenched her hands in her lap. "And in return?" His gray eyes darkened. "Your son gets his surgery. No debts. No obligations beyond this arrangement." Her breath caught. It was too much, too generous, but before she could refuse, Adrian leaned forward, his voice dropping an octave. "Don't mistake this for charity, Olivia." She stilled. "I get something out of this too," he continued. "People question me less when I have someone by my side. It keeps them from prying into my affairs." That made more sense. It wasn't about kindness, it was about control. He wasn't offering her help. He was securing his own advantage. And yet, Noah, her sweet, bright-eyed little boy waiting for a surgery that could save his life. She closed her eyes for a brief second, then exhaled. "Fine, I'll do it." Adrian nodded once. "Good. But before she could leave, he added, "We start tomorrow." The next morning, Olivia stood in front of the massive full-length mirror in one of the mansion's guest rooms, staring at her reflection in stunned disbelief. She barely recognized herself. Gone were the simple jeans and faded blouses she had worn for years. In their place was an elegant midnight blue dress that clung to her curves in all the right places. The fabric was smooth, expensive, nothing like the thrift store clothing she was used to. A stylist had come in earlier, curling her hair into soft waves and applying a subtle touch of makeup. She looked different, like she belonged in Adrian Wolf's world. A knock on the door made her jump. "Come in," she called, still struggling to process everything. The butler, Samuel, entered, his face impassive as usual. "Mr. Wolf is waiting for you." Olivia swallowed hard, smoothing her dress before following him. As they descended the grand staircase, her nerves tightened. This was insane. She had spent her entire life avoiding men like Adrian Wolf, men with power, wealth, and the ability to manipulate the world around them. Now she was about to step right into the lion's den. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw him standing by the front entrance, dressed in a crisp black tuxedo, and for the first time, she understood why people feared him. Adrian Wolf wasn't just wealthy. He owned every space he stepped into. His presence was a force undeniable and inescapable. His gaze flicked over her, his expression unreadable. "You clean up well," he said finally. Her face heated. "I feel ridiculous. You look the part." She swallowed hard. "And if I mess up?" His gray eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. "You won't." There was no room for failure in his world, and if she wanted to save her son, she had no choice but to succeed. The gala was held at one of the most prestigious venues in the city. Chandeliers dripped with crystals, and the scent of expensive champagne lingered in the air. Olivia had never felt more out of place in her entire life, yet Adrian guided her through the crowd effortlessly, introducing her as if she truly belonged. "This is Olivia," he said at one point, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. "A close companion." Close companion, not a maid, not a date, just a vague, untouchable title. The whispers started almost immediately. "Who is she?" "She's beautiful. Where did he find her?" "Do you think she's serious or just another passing phase?" Olivia tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the role she had agreed to play. She smiled when needed, nodded politely, and let Adrian lead the conversations. But as the night wore on, she realized something. He wasn't just using her. He was protecting her. Whenever someone's questions grew too prying, he would smoothly deflect. Whenever someone looked at her with too much scrutiny, he would shift the conversation. And for the first time since she had entered his world, she felt something unexpected. Safe. She didn't know why Adrian was doing this, but she knew one thing. This arrangement was going to change both of their lives, whether they were ready for it or not. Section 3. Olivia wasn't sure what was more unsettling, the way Adrian handled the social elite with ruthless ease, or the way he shielded her from their scrutiny without so much as a word. For the past hour, she had stood beside him as he made rounds through the ballroom, shaking hands with CEOs, exchanging polite yet clipped words with politicians, and offering cold smiles to men and women who, despite their wealth, seemed to fear him. It was an entirely different world from what she was used to, and she wasn't sure how she fit into it. But Adrian knew exactly where he stood. Every word he spoke was calculated, every gesture measured. It was control. She watched as a man approached, his tuxedo crisp but slightly wrinkled, his smile wide yet laced with something that made Olivia uneasy. "Adrian," the man greeted, his voice slick like oil. "I see you've finally brought company." Adrian's hand remained at the small of her back, a gesture that felt more like a warning than a display of affection. "This is Olivia." The man's eyes flicked to her, slow and assessing. "A pleasure. I was beginning to think you'd never settle down." Adrian didn't smile. "I don't think settling is the right word." The man chuckled, but Olivia caught the flicker of discomfort in his expression. Who was Adrian Wolf that even the wealthy tread carefully around him? And why did she feel like she had just stepped into a game she wasn't ready to play? She straightened her shoulders, meeting the man's gaze without hesitation. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Langston," the man supplied. "Andrew Langston." Olivia recognized the name. He owned a chain of luxury hotels, his face often splashed across magazines alongside high-profile celebrities. Langston's smirk widened as he took in her expression. "Ah, I see you've heard of me." Adrian's grip on her waist tightened slightly. "Enough." Langston raised an eyebrow. "Protective, are we?" Olivia could feel the tension coil between the two men, but before she could react, Adrian smoothly changed the subject. "You're expanding into Europe." Langston's smugness faltered for a second. "Yes, yet you haven't finalized your contracts." Langston's jaw tensed. "Business negotiations take time." Adrian's lips curved slightly, but there was nothing warm about it. "So does failure." Langston's expression darkened. Olivia didn't know what silent battle was being waged between them, but she wasn't foolish enough to interrupt. The tension between them stretched before Langston finally forced a tight smile. "We'll talk later," he muttered before turning and vanishing into the crowd. Olivia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Adrian glanced at her. "You okay?" She nodded. That was, intense. His expression didn't change. Langston is an opportunist. He preys on weakness. She hesitated before asking, "And what does that make you?" Adrian didn't answer right away. Then, in a voice so quiet she almost missed it, he said, "Someone who doesn't have the luxury of weakness." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of champagne toasts, hushed conversations, and silent observations. Olivia played her part well, standing beside Adrian with carefully curated poise, nodding when necessary, smiling when required. But by the time they finally left the gala, exhaustion weighed heavy in her bones. The car ride back to the estate was silent. She expected Adrian to be tense, calculating his next move like a chess player plotting an inevitable checkmate. Instead, he sat back against the leather seat, eyes closed, his jaw tight as if holding back a storm. It was the first time she had seen him look anything other than composed, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she found herself asking, "Are you okay?" His eyes opened, gray and unreadable. For a moment he didn't speak. Then, with a voice laced with something she couldn't quite place, he said, "I should be asking you that." She let out a soft laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I think I handled myself well enough." Adrian studied her for a long moment before nodding. "You did." Silence stretched between them, and then, before she could stop herself, she whispered, "Why did you really choose me?" His gaze darkened. For a split second, she thought he wouldn't answer. But then, in a voice barely above a murmur, he said, "Because you're the only one who doesn't want anything from me." The words sent a shiver down her spine. Because they weren't entirely true. She needed his money, but she also knew that wasn't what he meant. The people in his world wanted power, control, leverage. She was the only one who had never asked him for anything beyond what was absolutely necessary. And somehow, that made her the most dangerous person in the room. The next morning, Olivia woke with a headache. Her body ached from standing in heels all night, her mind still reeling from the whirlwind of the gala. She had only just made it to the kitchen when she spotted Samuel, the butler, preparing a tray. She frowned. "Who's that for?" Samuel barely looked up. "Mr. Wolfe." Olivia hesitated. "Is he okay?" Samuel paused before answering. "He returned from a meeting early this morning. He hasn't left his study since." Something about that made her stomach twist. She wasn't sure why she cared, but before she could overthink it, she grabbed the tray from Samuel's hands. The butler blinked. "Miss Olivia." "I'll take it," she said, already walking toward the study before she could change her mind. She knocked once before pushing the door open. Adrian was at his desk, his suit jacket draped over the back of the chair, his tie loosened. His eyes lifted to hers, surprise flickering across his features. "I brought you breakfast," she said, holding up the tray. His gaze shifted to the food before returning to her. "I don't remember asking for it." She sighed, setting the tray down on his desk. "That doesn't mean you don't need it." He didn't say anything, but something in his expression softened. She hesitated before asking, "Rough night?" Adrian exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Something like that." She should have left it at that. She should have turned around and walked away. But instead she sat down across from him. And for the first time she saw something beyond the cold, ruthless CEO. She saw a man who was tired, a man who carried too much weight on his shoulders, a man who, despite everything, had helped her when he didn't have to. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, she wanted to return the favor. So instead of pressing him for answers, she simply picked up a piece of toast and handed it to him. Adrian raised an eyebrow. "What are you doing?" She shrugged. making sure you eat. He studied her for a long moment before, finally, taking the toast from her hand. It was such a small moment, insignificant really, and yet it felt like something had shifted, something neither of them were quite ready to acknowledge. And as Olivia sat there, watching the most powerful man she had ever met take a quiet bite of breakfast, she realized something. This arrangement was far more complicated than she had thought, and it was only just beginning. Section 4. Olivia didn't know what had come over her. She had no business sitting in Adrian Wolf's study, watching him eat breakfast as if they were old friends. And yet there she was, across from him, witnessing something that felt strangely intimate. Him, silent and brooding, chewing methodically, eyes unfocused as if lost in thought. She should have left. She should have told him to rest, walked out, and continued with her duties. Instead, she stayed. And he let her. The silence between them stretched, thick with something neither of them was willing to name. Finally, Adrian leaned back in his chair, setting his fork down. "You don't have to babysit me," Olivia smirked. "You think this is babysitting?" His lips twitched, but he didn't smile. "It feels like it." "Well, that's not my fault," she teased, crossing her arms. "You're the one who looks like he hasn't slept in days." Adrian exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. "It comes with the territory." Olivia tilted her head. "The territory of being a billionaire?" He gave her a dry look. "The territory of being responsible for things other people don't see." She frowned. "Like what?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his coffee, staring into the dark liquid as if it held all the answers. "There's always something at stake," he finally said. "A company, a deal, a reputation. People like Langston." He scoffed. "They wait for moments of weakness. If you're not careful, they take everything." Olivia didn't know what to say to that. She had spent her life worrying about money, about medical bills, about keeping a roof over her son's head. But this was a different kind of pressure. "Sounds exhausting," she murmured. Adrian let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "It is." She studied him for a moment. "So why do it?" He looked up then, and for the first time, she saw something in his expression that wasn't confidence or control. It was something raw, something real. "Because it's all I know." And somehow that answer unsettled her more than anything else. By the time Olivia left Adrian's study, the rest of the household had come to life. Maids were dusting furniture, chefs were prepping lunch, and Samuel was already organizing the day's schedule. Olivia checked her phone. 2 missed calls from the hospital. Her heart lurched. She rushed to the nearest empty hallway before calling them back, her fingers trembling slightly. The nurse answered on the second ring. "Ms. Parker?" "Yes," Olivia said quickly. "Is everything okay? Is Jake okay?" "He's stable," the nurse reassured her. "But we need to discuss the next steps for his surgery." Olivia closed her eyes, relief washing over her. "Okay, there's one issue," the nurse continued, hesitating. "The hospital needs a final payment before we can proceed with the scheduling." Olivia's stomach twisted. "How much?" she whispered. The number the nurse gave her made her knees weak. She had barely saved half of that. "I understand," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I'll get the money." But she had no idea how. She had taken this job to save up, but even working long hours, it wasn't enough. Maybe she could ask for an advance, or maybe... "Miss Parker?" She turned to see Samuel standing at the end of the hall, his usual composed expression in place. "Mr. Wolf requested your presence." She frowned. "For what?" Samuel hesitated. "He didn't say." Olivia sighed, nodding. "I'll be right there." She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and followed Samuel toward Adrian's office. Whatever this was, she would handle it, because she didn't have a choice. Adrian was standing by the window when she entered, his hands in his pockets, his back to her. She hesitated before stepping inside. "You wanted to see me?" He didn't turn. "Close the door." Her stomach twisted, but she did as he asked. For a long moment he said nothing. Then finally he spoke. "I know about your son." The words hit her like a freight train. Olivia's heart pounded. "What?" Adrian turned then, his gaze unreadable. "Jake. His condition, the surgery, I know." Panic shot through her. "How?" she demanded. I looked into it." She clenched her fists. "You had no right." "I had every right." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "You work in my house. I needed to know who you are." Olivia felt her breath catch. Of course, he was Adrian Wolf, a man who left nothing to chance. Still, the violation burned. You had no reason to— I did. She glared at him. And what reason was that? Adrian stepped closer. Because I don't like seeing you struggle. Her anger faltered. I'm not your problem, she whispered. Adrian's jaw tightened. Maybe not, but I'm making it my problem anyway. Olivia shook her head. I don't need your pity. This isn't pity. Then what is it? Adrian was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice so quiet it sent a shiver down her spine, he said, It's an offer. She frowned. An offer? Adrian nodded. Let me pay for the surgery. Her heart stopped. What? I'll cover the cost. Everything. No strings attached. Olivia's mind raced. She should say yes. She should grab the lifeline he was throwing her and run. But something about it felt wrong. Because nothing in Adrian Wolf's world was free. I can't accept that, she finally said. Adrian's expression didn't change. Why? She swallowed hard. Because I don't want to owe you. His gaze darkened. I'm not asking for anything in return. I don't believe that. Adrian exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. Damn it, Olivia. I'm trying to help you. She took a step back. Then let me help myself. He stared at her, his jaw clenched, his eyes stormy. For a moment she thought he would argue. But then finally he nodded. Fine, he said. Then I'll give you another option. Olivia frowned. What kind of option? Adrian's lips curled slightly, but there was no amusement in his expression. Work for me, he said simply. She blinked. I already do. Olivia's stomach twisted. What does that mean? It means, Adrian said, stepping closer, I'll double your salary. You'll work under me, assisting with projects, handling things personally. The money you need. You'll earn it. It was tempting, too tempting, and yet, what's the catch? She whispered. Adrian studied her for a long moment before answering. The only catch, he said, is that you'll have to trust me. Olivia's heart pounded. Trust him. The most dangerous man she had ever met. Could she really do that? And as Adrian stood there waiting for her answer, Olivia realized something terrifying. She wasn't afraid of working for him. She was afraid of what might happen if she did. Section 5. Olivia felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Adrian's offer lingered between them, heavy and unspoken. Work for him, directly. A salary high enough to save her son, to secure his surgery, to finally give her a chance at stability. But what did that really mean? Her fingers curled into her palms. She had spent her entire life clawing for control, making choices that kept her son safe, ensuring that no one could manipulate her or use her desperation against her. And now, Adrian Wolf, the most powerful man she had ever met, was asking her to put everything in his hands. She swallowed hard. What exactly would this job entail? She asked, forcing her voice to stay steady. Adrian leaned back against his desk, crossing his arms. Whatever I need. Olivia's pulse spiked. That's vague. He smirked slightly. It's intentional. A slow dread crept into her stomach. So, you want me to sign up for something without knowing the details? Adrian let out a soft chuckle. Relax, Olivia. I'm not asking you to do anything illegal. That's not exactly comforting, she muttered. Adrian studied her carefully, and for the first time since he made his offer, he softened. I mean it, he said. I need someone I can trust, someone with a backbone, someone who won't lie to me or tell me what I want to hear just because my last name is Wolf. His words were measured, but there was an underlying weight to them. It was the first time he had openly admitted something like that his life, despite its wealth and luxury, was filled with dishonesty, and he thought she could be different. Olivia looked away. Why me? She whispered. Adrian was quiet for a long moment. Then in a voice so low she almost didn't hear it, he said, Because you don't need me. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. He was right. She wasn't like the people who circled around him, hoping to gain something. She didn't need his money, his power, or his influence. She only needed one thing, her son's life. But she would never let herself become dependent on Adrian Wolf. Never. Taking a deep breath, she met his gaze head on. If I say yes, she said slowly, then I need a contract. Terms. Boundaries. If you're hiring me, I want everything in writing. Adrian's lips curved into something close to approval. Smart. She lifted her chin. I don't trust people easily. Adrian's eyes darkened. Neither do I. They stood there staring at each other, both unwilling to blink first. Then Adrian pushed away from the desk. I'll have the contract drawn up, he said. Olivia exhaled. Fine. But as Adrian turned back to his desk, she had the sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. That night, Olivia lay awake in her small bedroom staring at the ceiling. Her mind was racing. Had she made the right decision? Adrian was dangerous, not in the traditional sense, but in a way that unsettled her. He was unpredictable. She had spent so long controlling every part of her life, making sure no one could take advantage of her or Jake. And now she was stepping into the unknown. But what choice do I have? Jake's surgery wasn't something she could put off. Her savings weren't enough. And no matter how much she hated to admit it, Adrian's offer was a solution. A lifeline. Still, something inside her whispered that she was walking into something much more complicated than she could see. And for the first time in a long time, Olivia wasn't sure if she was making a smart decision or a terrible mistake. The next morning, a neatly bound contract was waiting for her in Adrian's office. She hesitated before picking it up. You work fast, she muttered. Adrian smirked. Efficiency is key. Olivia flipped through the pages. The contract was clean, professional, and laid everything out in black and white. Her salary would be triple what she made as a maid. She would work directly under Adrian, handling schedules, organizing documents, attending events when needed. And there was one clause that stood out. No personal obligations. It was spelled out clearly. Adrian would not have any personal expectations of her. Their relationship would remain strictly professional. Olivia let out a slow breath. She had expected something else, something less decent. But Adrian Wolf was full of surprises. She reached for the pen and signed her name. When she looked up, Adrian was watching her carefully. Congratulations, he said smoothly. You work for me now. Olivia set the pen down. I hope I don't regret it. Adrian tilted his head. That makes two of us. And just like that, the deal was sealed. Olivia's first day in her new position was overwhelming. She had expected to be thrown into chaos, but Adrian was surprisingly structured. His office was immaculate, his staff was efficient, and Adrian himself, focused, ruthless. He worked through meetings with ease, shutting down negotiations that wasted his time, controlling every room he stepped into. But Olivia saw something else too. The way his employees tiptoed around him, the way they hesitated before speaking as if they were afraid of saying the wrong thing, the way no one challenged him, except her. When Adrian snapped at an assistant for fumbling paperwork, Olivia stepped in. Not everyone moves at your speed, Mr. Wolf. Adrian shot her a look. Then they shouldn't be working for me. Olivia crossed her arms. Maybe if you explained what you needed instead of assuming people can read your mind, things would run smoother. The room went dead silent. Everyone was waiting for Adrian to explode, but instead he exhaled sharply. And then he laughed. A short, low chuckle that sent a ripple of shock through the office. The staff stared, wide-eyed. Adrian shook his head, smirking. Noted. And just like that he moved on, as if it were normal for someone to talk back to him, as if she hadn't just done what no one else dared to do. Olivia had no idea what had just happened, but she did know one thing. Adrian Wolf wasn't just testing her. He was enjoying this, and that terrified her more than anything. Later that evening, Olivia sat outside in the gardens, needing a moment to herself. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind, and she hadn't even had time to check on Jake. She pulled out her phone, dialing the hospital. The nurse picked up after 2 rings. Ms. Parker? Hi, Olivia said breathlessly. I just wanted to check on Jake. The nurse smiled through the phone. He's doing well. He asked about you. Olivia's heart clenched. I miss him. He misses you too, but he's excited about his surgery. Olivia swallowed hard. She was doing this for him, everything. And no matter what happened with Adrian Wolf, she couldn't let herself forget that. She ended the call, exhaling slowly. Then, is everything okay? She turned. Adrian was standing there, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Olivia straightened. Yes, just checking on Jake. Adrian nodded slowly. Good. She hesitated. Why do you care? Adrian was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, Because I know what it's like to feel powerless. Something inside Olivia cracked. She didn't know what Adrian's past held, but in that moment, for the first time since she met him, she realized something. Adrian Wolf wasn't just a billionaire with too much power. He was a man who had once been powerless too, and that changed everything. Section 6. The next few days passed in a blur of constant movement. Olivia's new position required her to be everywhere at once, organizing Adrian's calendar, sorting through documents, attending meetings, and even handling the occasional PR nightmare when one of Wolf Industries' subsidiaries made the wrong kind of headlines. She had never worked this hard in her life, and yet, oddly enough, she didn't hate it. Adrian had thrown her into the deep end, but he wasn't unfair. He demanded excellence, but he also listened when she pushed back. He didn't tolerate excuses, but he also didn't expect her to know everything instantly. Most surprising of all, he respected her boundaries. There was no inappropriate behavior, no veiled threats, no games. Despite the rumors about him, Adrian Wolf treated her with the same professional detachment he gave his senior executives, and that only made her more suspicious. Because if there was one thing Olivia had learned about powerful men, it was that they never gave something without expecting something in return. She just hadn't figured out what Adrian wanted yet, but she knew it was coming. It was nearly midnight when Olivia finally left Adrian's office. The entire building was empty except for the security guards. She had worked late every night that week, but this was the first time she felt the exhaustion truly hit her. Her body ached. Her mind was sluggish and she could feel the pull of sleep calling her. But as she stepped outside, a sleek black car was waiting at the curb. Her stomach tightened. The window rolled down. "Adrian." "Get in," he said. Olivia hesitated. "I can take the subway," she muttered. Adrian sighed. "You're about to collapse. Just get in the car, Olivia." She exhaled, debating. Then reluctantly she slid inside. The warmth of the car wrapped around her instantly, and she tried not to groan at how good it felt. Adrian studied her for a long moment as the driver pulled away from the curb. "You're overworking yourself," she scoffed. "That's ironic coming from you." His lips twitched. "Fair point." Olivia leaned her head against the window, staring at the city lights. "I need this job," she admitted quietly. "I need the money for Jake." Adrian didn't respond for a long time. Then, in a voice softer than she'd ever heard from him, he said, "I know." Like he really knew. Not just about Jake's medical bills, but about the desperation, the sacrifices, the quiet terror of wondering if you'd make it through the next day. It wasn't the voice of a billionaire who had never struggled. It was the voice of a man who had once been drowning too. Olivia turned to him, searching his face. "Why do you care so much?" she whispered. Adrian didn't look at her. He just stared straight ahead. Then finally, "I had a brother." But the way his jaw clenched, the way his fingers curled into his palm, told her she hadn't. She held her breath. She had never heard a single mention of Adrian Wolf having a sibling. The media didn't talk about it. There were no records, no family statements, nothing. And she suddenly knew, whatever had happened to Adrian's brother, it wasn't good. She didn't push him to explain. She didn't ask. Because something about the way he sat there, staring out the window, told her he had already said more than he ever intended to. And for the first time since she met him, Olivia realized Adrian Wolf wasn't just her boss. He was a man carrying ghosts she couldn't see. The next morning, Olivia woke up feeling off. She kept replaying Adrian's words in her head. She had a million questions, but she knew better than to ask them. Adrian wasn't the kind of man who shared personal details easily, and she had already pushed her luck last night. Still, something had shifted between them. She could feel it. The air between them was different. It wasn't just professional anymore. There was something else there, something unspoken. And Olivia didn't know what to do with that. She had spent years keeping her life separate from men like Adrian Wolf. Men with too much power, too much control, too many secrets. But now she was in the middle of his world. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to leave. Olivia settled into her new role, and despite her exhaustion, she was getting good at it. Adrian was demanding, but he trusted her. And that was something no boss had ever given her before. Trust. It made her feel seen in a way she hadn't expected. And it scared her, because trust was dangerous, especially when it came to men like Adrian Wolf. One evening, Adrian asked Olivia to accompany him to a high-profile charity gala. She frowned. "I thought my job didn't involve social events." Adrian smirked. "You're my executive assistant. This falls under your duties." She raised an eyebrow. "So I'm basically your babysitter for the night?" Adrian chuckled. If that helps you sleep at night, sure. Olivia sighed, shaking her head. But deep down, she knew this was more than just a business event. She had been around Adrian long enough to know when he was hiding something. And right now, he was hiding something. But she wasn't sure if she wanted to know what it was. The night of the gala, Olivia stepped out of her small apartment to find a car waiting for her. And when she slid inside, Adrian was already there. His eyes flickered over her, slow and unreadable. "You clean up well," he murmured. Olivia rolled her eyes. "I'll take that as a compliment." He smirked, but there was something else in his gaze, something that made her pulse speed up. She looked away. This was just a job. That was all it would ever be, right? When they arrived at the gala, Olivia felt every pair of eyes turn toward them. Adrian Wolfe was always the center of attention, and now, with her at his side, she could feel the speculation in the air. "Who's she?" someone whispered. "His new assistant," another murmured. "She's gorgeous. Think she's sleeping with him?" Olivia's jaw tightened. She had expected this. She knew people would talk, but that didn't mean it didn't sting. "Ignore them," Olivia swallowed. Easy for him to say. She wasn't used to this world. She wasn't used to people assuming things about her. But before she could respond, a familiar voice interrupted. Olivia turned, and instantly felt the tension in Adrian's body. A man stood before them, smirking. Tall, sharp features, the same piercing eyes as Adrian, and suddenly, Olivia knew. This was the brother Adrian never talked about, the one the world thought didn't exist. And whatever had happened between them, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Section 7. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she watched the silent standoff between Adrian and the man standing before them. The resemblance was striking. Same dark, calculating eyes, same sharp jawline, same effortless confidence. But while Adrian carried himself with a quiet, controlled authority, this man radiated something different, something more volatile, more dangerous. Adrian's entire body tensed. It was a reaction Olivia had never seen from him before. She had seen him frustrated, seen him annoyed, but she had never seen him look like this, like he was staring down a ghost. "Sebastian," Adrian said, his voice carefully neutral. "Sebastian Wolfe." Olivia recognized the name instantly. She had heard it whispered in business circles, mentioned in hushed conversations at Wolfe Industries. The other Wolfe brother, the one who had vanished from public life years ago, walking away from the empire Adrian had built. Some said he had been forced out. Others claimed he had left of his own accord, but no one really knew the truth. Until now. Sebastian's smirk widened, but his eyes were cold. "I see you're still making bold choices, brother. Showing up with a pretty face by your side? What happened? Finally decide you needed a personal distraction?" Olivia stiffened. Adrian's jaw clenched. "Leave her out of this." Sebastian chuckled, shaking his head. "Relax, I'm just making an observation." His gaze flickered to Olivia. "Though I have to say, I'm curious. Do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself into?" Olivia held her ground. She didn't know the history between these two, but she wasn't about to let this man intimidate her. "I know exactly who I'm working for," she said evenly. Sebastian laughed. "I doubt that." Adrian exhaled sharply. "What do you want, Sebastian?" Sebastian placed a hand over his chest in mock innocence. "Can't I just say hello to my dear brother?" "You haven't spoken to me in years," Adrian said flatly. "So no, I don't think this is just a friendly visit." Sebastian's smirk faded slightly. His eyes darkened. "You're right," he admitted. "This isn't a social call. I came to warn you." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then Adrian let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Warn me." Sebastian nodded. "You might think you have everything under control, but you don't. There are people watching you, Adrian. People waiting for you to slip." He tilted his head. "And you're making it so damn easy for them." Adrian's expression remained unreadable, but Olivia could sense the tension building. "I don't need your warnings," Adrian said coolly. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Adrian's gaze hardened. "You don't know anything about my life." Sebastian's lips pressed together. "No, then tell me. Does she know?" He nodded toward Olivia. Adrian stilled, and just like that, Olivia knew this conversation had just taken a turn she wasn't prepared for. She swallowed. "Know what?" Neither man spoke. Sebastian sighed. "See, that's what I mean." He turned back to Adrian. "You're playing with fire, and whether you realize it or not, you're dragging her into it too." Adrian's hand curled into a fist at his side. "Stay out of my business, Sebastian." Sebastian studied him for a long moment. Then he exhaled and took a step back. "Fine, do what you want." He gave Olivia one last unreadable glance before turning away. As he walked off into the crowd, Olivia felt her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to Adrian. "What was that about?" Adrian ran a hand through his hair, his expression unreadable. "Nothing you need to worry about." She narrowed her eyes. "That's not an answer." Adrian sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "It's complicated, Olivia." She folded her arms. "Try me." He hesitated. For a second, she thought he might actually tell her, but then just as quickly he shook his head. "Not here." Before she could push further, someone called Adrian's name. A business associate. Someone who wanted a word. And just like that, the conversation was over. But Olivia wasn't going to forget it. Not by a long shot. The rest of the gala was a blur. Olivia did her job, smiled when necessary, and made polite conversation when expected. But her mind was spinning. Sebastian's warning. The tension between the brothers. The secrets Adrian refused to talk about. What had Sebastian meant when he said Adrian was making mistakes? And more importantly, what wasn't Adrian telling her? By the time they left the event, Olivia was exhausted, mentally and physically. But as she climbed into the car beside Adrian, she couldn't hold her questions back any longer. "Tell me about your brother," she said softly. Adrian didn't respond right away. He stared out the window, his jaw tight. Then, after a long moment, "We built Wolf Industries together," he admitted. "From the ground up. Sebastian was supposed to be my partner. We were supposed to do it together." Olivia listened silently. "But then he left," Adrian continued. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the emotion buried underneath. "Walked away from everything we built. Just disappeared. No warning. No explanation." She frowned. "Why?" Adrian's jaw clenched. "Because he didn't want to be me." Olivia blinked. "What does that mean?" Adrian let out a bitter laugh. "It means Sebastian didn't want the responsibility, the pressure, the weight of it all. He thought I was too ruthless, too ambitious, so he left. And now," his lips curled, "now he gets to stand on the outside and judge me like he's better than me." Olivia exhaled. "And do you think he's right?" Adrian turned to her sharply. She didn't back down. For a long moment he just looked at her, then quietly, "I don't know." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Because for the first time since she met him, Adrian Wolf didn't sound like a man who had all the answers. He sounded like a man who was still searching for them. They didn't speak for the rest of the ride. When they arrived at Olivia's apartment, Adrian walked her to the door. But just before she went inside, he caught her wrist. "Olivia." She turned back to him. His gaze was unreadable. "Be careful," he said. Her brows furrowed. "Of what?" Adrian hesitated and then, finally, "Of getting too close." Her breath hitched and then he let go. And just like that, he was gone. But Olivia knew one thing for certain. Whatever this was between them, it was no longer just professional, and that terrified her. Section 8. Olivia lay awake in bed long after Adrian had left, staring at the ceiling, her mind swirling with unanswered questions. She replayed the night's events over and over. The tension between Adrian and his brother. The cryptic warnings, the way Adrian had told her to be careful. Careful of what? Or who? Sebastian's words echoed in her head. "Do you even know what you've gotten yourself into?" She had thought she did. She had thought Adrian Wolf was just another ruthless businessman, cold and calculating, with a soft spot for her son. But the more she got to know him, the more she realized there was so much she didn't know. And now she wasn't sure if she wanted to find out. But she had no choice. She was already in too deep. The next morning, Olivia was exhausted, but she forced herself to push the night's events to the back of her mind. She had a shift at the mansion, and no matter what was going on in Adrian's world, she still had a job to do. She arrived early, as always, slipping into the familiar routine of cleaning and organizing the vast, opulent home. The house was eerily quiet today, the usual energy of the place subdued. The staff was whispering, casting nervous glances at each other as they worked. She frowned, pausing by the grand staircase where two of the maids were speaking in hushed voices. "What's going on?" Olivia asked. The women hesitated before one of them, Maria, sighed. "There was a break-in last night, or at least, an attempted one." Olivia's stomach dropped. "What?" Maria nodded, lowering her voice. Security caught someone trying to get into Mr. Wolf's office. They didn't take anything, but it's unsettling. Olivia swallowed hard. Someone had tried to break into Adrian's office, and after last night's confrontation with Sebastian, she had a sinking feeling this wasn't just a coincidence. Without another word, she hurried toward Adrian's office. The door was ajar, and when she stepped inside, she found Adrian standing by the window, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. She hesitated. Adrian. He turned at the sound of her voice, his eyes scanning her face. For a second, she thought she saw something flicker there. Relief? Concern? But it was gone just as quickly. "You heard," he said simply. She nodded. "The staff is talking." Adrian sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Of course they are." She didn't have to say Sebastian's name. They both knew who she meant. Adrian's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but whoever it was, they were looking for something." Olivia shivered. What could they possibly want? Adrian didn't answer right away. He walked to his desk, running a finger over the polished surface, deep in thought. Finally, he said, "There's something you should know, Olivia." Her heart pounded. "I told you my brother left because he didn't want the responsibility." Adrian continued, his voice measured. "But that wasn't the full story." She held her breath. Adrian met her gaze. "He left because I forced him out." Olivia's eyes widened. "What?" Adrian exhaled, leaning against his desk. "Sebastian was reckless. He was making bad deals, gambling with the company's future. I tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. So I made a choice. I cut him out, I took over the company, and he disappeared." She swallowed. "And now he's back." Adrian nodded. "And he wants something." Olivia hugged herself. "And you think he's the one who tried to break in?" "I don't know," Adrian admitted. "But I do know one thing." She looked up at him and his eyes darkened. "This isn't over." For the next few days, the mansion was on high alert. Extra security was brought in, and Adrian was more guarded than ever. Olivia could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken fear that something else was coming. She tried to focus on her work, on Aiden, on anything other than the nagging feeling that she was walking into something dangerous. But then something happened that changed everything. It was late evening when Olivia received a phone call from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" Silence, and then a voice she didn't recognize. "Miss Hart, I suggest you leave Wolf Manor while you still can." Olivia's blood turned to ice. "Who is this?" she demanded. A low chuckle. "Consider this a warning. Stay out of Adrian Wolf's affairs, or you'll regret it." The line went dead. Olivia stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. She barely had time to process the words before a knock sounded on her door. She jumped, gripping her phone tightly. Slowly, she walked to the door and peered through the peephole. "Adrian." She exhaled shakily before opening it. "What are you doing here?" Adrian's gaze flickered over her, his expression unreadable. "I needed to see you." She hesitated before stepping aside to let him in. He walked past her, his presence filling the small apartment. He looked tense, more than usual. She closed the door and turned to him. "What's going on?" Then quietly, "I need you to trust me, Olivia." Her stomach twisted. "Why?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because things are about to get complicated." She let out a hollow laugh. "I think we passed complicated a long time ago." He gave her a small, tired smirk. "Fair point." She exhaled. "Adrian, someone just called me." "I don't know. But they told me to leave Wolf Manor. That if I didn't, I'd regret it." Adrian's entire body went rigid. His hands clenched at his sides. "Did they threaten you?" She hesitated. "Not directly." He took a deep breath. "I need you to be honest with me, Olivia. Are you scared?" She swallowed hard. Yes, but she wouldn't say it. She squared her shoulders. "I can handle myself." He let out a quiet curse under his breath, pacing the small living room. "This is exactly what I didn't want." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He stopped, turning to face her. "I didn't want you involved in this. I tried to keep you out of it, but now..." He exhaled sharply. "Now they're coming after you too." A chill ran down her spine. "They?" she echoed. Adrian hesitated, then quietly. "There are people who don't want me in control of Wolf Industries, Olivia. People who think I don't belong in the position I'm in." His jaw clenched. "And they're getting desperate." Olivia swallowed. "And you think they're trying to scare me away?" He nodded. She exhaled shakily. "What do we do?" Adrian's gaze locked onto hers. "We fight back." Her breath caught, and in that moment she knew. She wasn't just an employee anymore, she was part of this war, and she had no idea if she'd make it out unscathed. Section 9. The weight of Adrian's words settled over Olivia like a thick fog. We fight back. She had no idea what that truly meant, but one thing was clear. She was in the middle of something far bigger than she had ever imagined. Her instincts told her to walk away, to take Aiden and leave before she got pulled even deeper into the chaos surrounding Adrian Wolf. But there was something about the way he had looked at her, raw, vulnerable, and filled with something she couldn't quite define, that made her stay. And now there was no turning back. The next morning, Olivia arrived at the mansion with a new sense of awareness. Security had doubled overnight. Men in black suits patrolled the grounds, earpieces in place, eyes scanning for threats. The air was thick with tension, as if the very walls of Wolf Manor were bracing for an attack. She made her way inside, clutching her purse a little tighter. Maria, one of the senior maids, approached her with a nervous expression. "Something's happening, isn't it?" she whispered. Olivia hesitated. She wasn't sure how much she could say. Before she could respond, a deep voice cut through the air. "Olivia." She turned to see Adrian standing at the top of the grand staircase. His presence was commanding as always, but there was an edge to him today, a barely concealed storm beneath the surface. "I need to speak with you," he said. Maria gave Olivia a worried glance before hurrying away. Taking a deep breath, Olivia followed Adrian into his office. The door shut behind her with a quiet click. Adrian turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk." She folded her arms. "I gathered as much." He let out a tired exhale, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want you working here anymore." Her stomach dropped. "What?" "It's too dangerous," he said. "Whoever threatened you isn't going to stop, and if they see you as a weakness—" "I'm not a weakness," Olivia interrupted, her voice sharp, "and I'm not leaving." His eyes darkened. "Olivia!" Something flickered in his gaze, something like admiration. After a long pause, he sighed. "Then I have no choice." She frowned. "No choice but to what?" "I'm assigning you a bodyguard." Her eyes widened. "Excuse me?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "If you refuse to leave, then I need to make sure you're safe. You'll have protection at all times." She stared at him. "That's ridiculous." He arched an eyebrow. "Is it?" "Yes." She threw her hands up. "I'm a maid, Adrian. I clean your house. I am not some high-profile socialite who needs security following her around." His gaze locked onto hers. "You're not just a maid, Olivia. Not anymore." The air between them shifted. Her pulse pounded in her ears. "And what is that supposed to mean?" Adrian exhaled, his gaze never wavering. "It means that whether you like it or not, you're involved in this now, and I will not risk something happening to you." There was a finality in his tone that sent shivers down her spine. Later that evening, Olivia sat in her small apartment staring at the business card Adrian had given her. "James Callahan, private security." She exhaled, rubbing her temples. This was insane, absolutely insane. A knock at the door made her jump. She hesitated before opening it, and when she did, she found a tall man in a black suit standing there. He had a sharp, no-nonsense expression, his arms crossed over his chest. "Miss Hart," he greeted, "I'm James Callahan. Mr. Wolf assigned me to you." She resisted the urge to groan. "I told Adrian this wasn't necessary." James gave her an unimpressed look. "And yet here I am." She sighed. "How is this supposed to work exactly?" "I'll be following you throughout the day," he said matter-of-factly. "I'll make sure you get to and from work safely. If you need to go anywhere, I'll be there. Think of me as an insurance policy." Olivia folded her arms. "And if I refuse?" James gave her a flat look. "Then Mr. Wolf will fire you to force you to comply." Her mouth fell open. "You're joking." He didn't respond. She cursed under her breath. Adrian was unbelievable. "Fine," she muttered, "but don't get in my way." James smirked. "Wouldn't dream of it." For the next several days, Olivia adjusted to her new reality, one where she had a bodyguard shadowing her every move. It was infuriating. James was efficient, professional, and completely unaffected by her protests. He escorted her to work, waited outside while she cleaned, and then drove her home. She tried to ignore him, but it was impossible, especially because no matter how much she hated to admit it, She felt safer. The threat still lingered in the back of her mind, but knowing that someone was watching out for her eased the constant weight on her shoulders. One evening, as James drove her home, he spoke up for the first time outside of his usual routine updates. "You know, I've worked for Mr. Wolf for a long time," he said. She glanced at him. And I've never seen him act like this before." She frowned. "Like what?" James gave her a knowing look. "Like he actually cares about someone." Her breath caught. She turned away, staring out the window. "He's just doing this because he thinks I'm a liability." James chuckled. "If you say so." She hated how much his words affected her, but deep down she knew there was truth in them. That night, Olivia sat by Aiden's bed watching him sleep. His small chest rose and fell steadily. His tiny fingers curled around his blanket. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. No matter what was happening with Adrian, this was what mattered. She was doing this for him. But before she could lose herself in the comfort of the moment, her phone buzzed. She frowned and picked it up. An unknown number. A chill ran down her spine. She hesitated before answering. "Hello." Silence, and then, "You should have taken the warning, Miss Hart." A soft chuckle. "You're running out of time." The call ended. Olivia sat frozen, her heart pounding out of her chest. She barely had time to process the words before her door burst open. James stood there, his gun drawn. "Pack a bag," he ordered. She stared at him wide-eyed. "What?" His expression was grim. "We're leaving now." Fear gripped her. "What's happening?" James didn't hesitate. "They know where you live." Her stomach dropped. This wasn't just about Adrian anymore. Now it was about survival. Section 10. Olivia's world tilted dangerously, the weight of James's words crashing over her like a tidal wave. "They know where you live." Then, as if a switch had flipped, pure survival mode kicked in. She turned on her heel, sprinting toward Aiden's bedroom. James followed, his movements sharp and efficient. "Olivia, you have 5 minutes." She didn't argue. She grabbed Aiden's small duffel bag from the closet and threw in his essentials: clothes, his favorite stuffed bear, the inhaler he sometimes needed at night. Aiden stirred slightly in his sleep, his small body shifting under the blanket. Olivia's hands trembled as she bent down, brushing her fingers over his soft curls. "Mama," he mumbled, his voice groggy. "I need you to wake up, sweetheart," Olivia whispered, forcing her voice to stay steady. "We're going on a little trip." Aiden blinked up at her sleepily, but years of adapting to their unpredictable life made him obedient. He rubbed his eyes and reached for her without hesitation. She scooped him up, pressing a kiss to his forehead as she turned to James. "I'm ready." James nodded once. "Let's go." They moved quickly. James ushered them through the back exit of the apartment building, scanning the surroundings with sharp, calculated movements. A black SUV waited at the curb, its engine running. The moment Olivia and Aiden were inside, James slid into the driver's seat and peeled away from the curb. Olivia clutched Aiden close, her heart pounding. "Where are we going?" James's hands tightened around the wheel. "To someone who can protect you." Her stomach twisted. "Adrian." James didn't confirm it, but she knew. It was the only logical choice. Despite everything, despite the chaos, despite the danger, she felt a flicker of relief. Because there was one undeniable truth. Adrian Wolf would never let anything happen to them. They reached Wolf Manor just before dawn. The massive gates swung open upon their arrival, and the SUV rolled into the sprawling estate. The mansion loomed in the darkness, a fortress against the outside world. James barely had the car in park before Olivia was unbuckling Aiden and rushing inside. The second they stepped through the front doors, Adrian was there. Without a word, he reached for Aiden, his movements careful but urgent. The little boy blinked up at him in confusion, but when Adrian spoke, his voice was softer than Olivia had ever heard it. "You're safe now, little man." Aiden hesitated, then curled into Adrian's shoulder, too exhausted to protest. Olivia released a shaky breath. Adrian's eyes flicked up to hers, sharp and assessing. "What happened?" Olivia swallowed hard, still shaken from the call. "They called me. They said I should have taken the warning, that we were running out of time." Adrian's jaw clenched, his body going rigid. James stepped forward. "We need to move fast." Adrian's grip on Aiden tightened protectively. They crossed a line. Aiden whimpered softly, shifting in his sleep. Adrian's anger melted for a fraction of a second as he adjusted the little boy in his arms. Then, turning on his heel, he said, "Follow me." Olivia had spent months in the mansion, but she had never been to Adrian's private wing. He led them down a long corridor, past security checkpoints she hadn't even known existed. Finally, they reached a massive door. It swung open to reveal a beautifully furnished suite, warmer than she had expected, filled with rich mahogany furniture and soft, inviting tones. Adrian laid Aiden down on a large bed, carefully pulling a blanket over him. For all of Adrian's coldness, he looked completely at ease in that moment, like he belonged there, tucking her son into bed. She forced herself to look away. When she turned back, Adrian was watching her. "You're staying here," he said. Olivia opened her mouth to argue, but he held up a hand. "No discussions, Olivia, no negotiations. You're safer here than anywhere else." She hesitated. "And what about you?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "I have work to do." Something in his voice sent a chill down her spine. Olivia swallowed hard. "What kind of work?" Adrian didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his gaze dark and unreadable. "You should rest. I'll handle the rest." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The next 24 hours were a blur. Olivia tried to stay busy, but it was impossible. Security swarmed the estate. She overheard hushed conversations between James and Adrian's men, each one carrying an undercurrent of urgency. Adrian was gone for most of the day. She didn't ask where he went, but when he finally returned late that night, something in him had shifted. He looked exhausted and victorious. She stood in the doorway of the suite as he approached. "It's done." Her heart pounded. "What does that mean?" Adrian hesitated, then said, "They won't be bothering you again." A lump formed in her throat. "Adrian!" He stepped closer, his voice quiet. "It's over." She didn't know what he had done, and maybe she didn't want to. But the relief that crashed over her was undeniable. Her knees felt weak, and before she could stop herself, she reached for him. Adrian caught her easily, steadying her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, quietly, he said, "You and Aiden belong here." Her breath caught. She pulled back slightly, searching his face. Adrian's hands remained on her arms, holding her steady. "Stay," he murmured, "for as long as you want." A war raged inside her. Everything in her life had been temporary. Every job, every home, but this felt different. She looked past him to the bed where Aiden slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Then she looked back at Adrian, and this time she didn't run. Over the next few months, everything changed. Olivia stayed. Aiden's surgery was scheduled and paid for, Adrian's doing, though he never spoke of it. She kept working at the mansion, though now she was more than just a housekeeper. And Adrian, he became something more than just her boss. It was in the small things, the way he always made sure she ate, the way he played with Aiden, making him laugh until he couldn't breathe, the way he looked at her as if she were something precious. She had spent her entire life surviving, but for the first time she felt like she was living. One evening she found Adrian in his study, pouring himself a drink. She hesitated in the doorway. He glanced up, his gaze softening. "Couldn't sleep?" She shook her head. He gestured for her to come in. Slowly, she crossed the room and sat across from him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then quietly, she said, "Why did you do it?" Adrian set his glass down. "Do what?" She swallowed hard. "Save us." His gaze locked onto hers. Then with quiet certainty, he said, "Because you were always mine to protect." And just like that, the last of Olivia's walls crumbled. She didn't fight it and didn't run. Instead, she finally let herself fall. And this time, she had someone to catch her. The end. If you loved this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. More heartwarming stories coming soon. Stories coming soon. Stories coming soon. Stories